welcome to our Bible Ponder for this week. We're going to continue looking at the first book of Maccabees and maybe kind of wrap up our discussion of that in terms of its history. So we'll skip around a bit in the first couple of chapters just to give a brief overview of this kind of historical period. And then next week we'll move on to a different bit of literature, but we'll be talking about the same kind of time period. But this is going to be really interesting and give us a flavor of both the historical situation leading up to Jesus, but also some other interesting little historical tidbits, including some information about Hanukkah and what goes into that celebration and festival. So I'll read a couple of chunks to let us get a flavor for the text, but we're not going to just plow our way straight through. It's a lot of words, but we'll do our best to get through a bit of it. So one of the things to look out for as I'm reading through First Maccabees here is the same sort of biblical flavor, the biblical language. One of the things that you will notice and that I'll highlight for us as well as we go through is the idea and the ways in which the text is communicating to us that Judas Maccabeus and his family and the people revolting against what's called the Seleucid Empire or the Greeks of the time is that they saw themselves very firmly and deeply rooted in this Jewish history going all the way back to Moses and this idea of following the law and being true to the law and to God. And that acts as their justification for the war that they wage for independence from this sort of occupying army. So if you remember chapter 1, we did a speed read through it, mostly about Antiochus Epiphanes, who is a Greek king, descendant of Alexander the Great, who is ruling over the sort of land, and he is outlawing any sort of Jewish worship or practice, well, really any other religious practice that isn't his own, but specifically the context is outlawing any sort of Jewish practice, outlawing sacrifices, outlawing Sabbath keeping, outlawing circumcision, and some groups of the Jews begin to just go along with that and say, fine, we'll obey these laws, and other Jews don't take so kindly to that, and we're going to hear a bit about one of those families specifically. So I'll begin reading First Maccabees chapter 2, and we'll read a bit here in chapter 2, and then we're going to skip to a bit later to read about some more about Judas Maccabeus. So chapter 2, beginning in verse 1. In those days, that is the days in which Antiochus Epiphanes is instituting Gentile sacrifices, and they sacrifice a pig on the altar and outlaw Jewish worship. In those days, Maccabeus, son of John, son of Simeon, a priest in the family of Joarib, moved from Jerusalem and settled in Modin. He had 5 sons: John, surnamed Gadi, Simon, called Thassi, Judas, called Maccabeus, Eleazar, called Avaram, and Jonathan, called Apphaius. He saw the blasphemies being committed in Judah and Jerusalem, and he said, Alas, why was I born to see this, the ruin of my people, the ruin of the holy city, and to live there when it was given over to the enemy, and the sanctuary given over to aliens? Her temple has become like a person without honor. Her glorious vessels have been carried into exile. Her infants have been killed in her streets, her youths by the sword of the foe. What nation has not inherited her palaces and has not seized her spoils? All her adornment has been taken away. No longer free, she has become a slave. And see, our holy place, our beauty, and our glory have been laid waste. The Gentiles have profaned them. Why should we live any longer? Then Maccabeus and his sons tore their clothes and put on sackcloth and mourned greatly. You can hear in that language, again, echoes of what we had just looked at before in Lamentations and other bits of Hebrew poetry and the prophets, the lamenting for the city of Jerusalem. And now we're going to get an interesting story from It's a really visceral look at what was going on at the time. The king's officers who were enforcing the apostasy came to the town of Modin to make them offer sacrifice. Many from Israel came to them, and Mattathias and his sons were assembled. Then the king's officers spoke to Mattathias as follows: "You are a leader, honored and great in this town, and supported by sons and brothers. Now be the first to come and do what the king commands, as all the Gentiles and the people of Judah and those that are left in Jerusalem have done. Then you and your sons will be numbered among the friends of the king, and you and your sons will be honored with silver and gold and many gifts." So these people from the king from Antiochus Epiphanes say, "Hey, you're a big deal here. You go and offer the Gentile sacrifice. Be the first one." But Mattathias answered and said in a loud voice, "Even if all the nations that live under the rule of the king obey him, and have chosen to obey his commandments, every one of them abandoning the religion of their ancestors, I and my sons and my brothers will continue to live by the covenant of our ancestors. Far be it from us to desert the law and the ordinances. We will not obey the king's words by turning aside from our religion to the right hand or to the left." When he had finished speaking these words, a Jew came forward in the sight of all to offer sacrifice on the altar of Modin, according to the king's command. When Mattathias saw it, he burned with zeal, and his heart was stirred. He gave vent to righteous anger. He ran and killed him on the altar. At the same time, he killed the king's officer, who was forcing them to sacrifice, and he tore down the altar. Thus he burned with zeal for the law, just as Phinehas did against Zimri, son of Salu. Now, very visceral story. They are trying to get Mattathias as a leader in the community to be the first to sort of commit to Gentile rule, and he refuses. And so then a Jew, someone from the crowd, comes up to be the first to offer, and Mattathias, in rage, murders the man and murders him right on the altar, and then goes on a bit of a spree, killing the king's officer. He dismantles the altar. And the text says he burned with zeal for the law, just as Phinehas did against Zimri, son of Salu. And Phinehas was a priest during the time of the wandering in the wilderness. And Phinehas goes and slays Zimri, who has taken a Canaanite woman and married her against the law and against Moses. And so when he goes into her bed, as it were, Phinehas, in his zeal, goes in. The story says he impales them both on a spear. So again, that same sort of violence, but that zeal for following the law inspires this sort of action, and they'll use this language to justify a lot of what they do. Then Mattathias cried out in the town with a loud voice, saying, "Let everyone who is zealous for the law and supports the covenant come out with me." Then he and his sons fled to the hills and left all that they had in the town. So he's calling everyone together in this sort of remnant, these people to have back. And they go out into the hills. And this is, again, we've talked about before, in the stories of Jesus, when he is out in the wilderness gathering the 5,000 men and other women and children together to feed them, how it has shades of sort of gathering an army. It's stories like this, going out into the wilderness and out into the hills. At that time, many who were seeking righteousness and justice went down to the wilderness to live there, they and their sons, their wives, and their livestock, because troubles pressed heavily upon them. And it was reported to the king's officers and to the troops in Jerusalem, the city of David, that those who had rejected the king's command had gone down to the hiding places in the wilderness. Many pursued them and overtook them. They encamped opposite them and prepared for battle against them on the Sabbath day. So they've found that these people are fleeing into the wilderness in order to escape the sort of Gentile rule and the forcing them to give up their law. And they go out into the wilderness, and the Gentile army, the Greek army, is going to waylay them on the Sabbath day. And of course, on the Sabbath, you couldn't do anything. You couldn't work, you couldn't make food, you couldn't walk very far even. So waging a battle, theoretically, is out of the question. They said to them, "Enough of this. Come and do what the king commands, and you will live." But they said, "We will not come out, nor will we do what the king commands, and so profane the Sabbath day." Then the enemy quickly attacked them. But they did not answer them or hurl a stone at them or block up their hiding places, for they said, "Let us all die in our innocence. Heaven and earth testify for us that you are killing us unjustly." So this Greek army attacks them on the Sabbath, and they put up no fight so that they can keep the Sabbath. So they attacked them on the Sabbath, and they died with their wives and children and livestock, to the number of 1,000 persons. When Mattathias and his friends learned of it, they mourned for them deeply, and all said to their neighbors, "If we all do as our kindred have done, and refuse to fight with the Gentiles for our lives and for our ordinances, they will quickly destroy us from the earth." So they made this decision that day: "Let us fight against anyone who comes to attack us on the Sabbath day. Let us not all die as our kindred died in their hiding places." So then now they make a practical decision. Although they are fighting for preserving the law and keeping their ordinances and their Jewish custom, if they don't fight on the Sabbath, they're going to be wiped out. They're at a huge competitive disadvantage. And so they make the decision that they are going to fight on the Sabbath if they are attacked. So the rest of chapter 2, they begin to mount this sort of counterattack, and they begin to mount a rebellion. And then Mattathias dies, whether of old age or whatever, the time drew near for him to die, the text says. And he appoints different sons of his to rule in different ways. So his son Simeon will be sort of the leader, but he appoints Judas Maccabees, again, Judas the Hammer, who's a mighty warrior, to command the army. And then as we get into chapter 3, we hear about Judas and his army going on a string of victories and fighting their way through Jerusalem and sort of routing the Greek army, until we get to, in chapter 4, there's a massive battle at Emmaus. We remember the story in Luke of the road to Emmaus, of the disciples going from Jerusalem to Emmaus. It's not a huge journey, but there's a battle there, and Judas and the army wins against the Greeks, and they rout them. And so now we'll pick it up here in chapter 4, and this is the basis for the institution of Hanukkah. So let's read 1 Maccabees chapter 4, beginning in verse 36. Then Judas and his brothers said, "See, our enemies are crushed. Let us go up to cleanse the sanctuary and dedicate it." Because remember, Antiochus Epiphanes has waylaid it, he's taken everything, and he's profaned it by making sacrifices of pigs and other things against the law on the altar. So all the army assembled and went up to Mount Zion. There they saw the sanctuary desolate, the altar profaned, and the gates burned. In the courts, they saw bushes sprung up as in a thicket, or as on one of the mountains. They saw also the chambers of the priests in ruins. So for however many years, now this is 164, that Judas rededicates the temple. So it was a couple years earlier than that the temple was profaned. And so in that time, it's just sort of been left to rot, and now there's bushes growing out of the cracks. You know how that begins to happen. Then they tore their clothes and mourned with great lamentation. They sprinkled themselves with ashes and fell face down on the ground. And when the signal was given with trumpets, they cried out to heaven. Then Judas detailed men to fight against those in the citadel until he had cleansed the sanctuary. He chose blameless priests devoted to the law, and they cleansed the sanctuary and removed the defiled stones to an unclean place. They deliberated what to do about the altar of burnt offering, which had been profaned, and they thought it best to tear it down, so that it would not be a lasting shame to them that the Gentiles had defiled it. So they tore down the altar and stored the stones in a convenient place on the temple hill until a prophet should come to tell them what to do with them. Then they took unhewn stones as the law directs and built a new altar like the former one. They also rebuilt the sanctuary and the interior of the temple and consecrated the courts. They made new holy vessels and brought the lampstand, the altar of incense, and the table into the temple. Then they offered incense on the altar and lit the lamps on the lampstand, and these gave light to the temple. They placed on the bread of the table They placed the bread on the table and hung up the curtains. Thus they finished all the work they had undertaken. Early in the morning, on the 25th day of the 9th month, which is the month of Chislev, in the 148th year, Chislev, they rose and offered sacrifice, as the law directs, on the new altar of burnt offering that they had built. At the very season and on the very day that the Gentiles had profaned it, it was dedicated with songs and harps and lutes and cymbals. All the people fell on their faces and worshipped and blessed heaven who had prospered them. So they celebrated the dedication of the altar for 8 days and joyfully offered burnt offerings. They offered a sacrifice of well-being and a thanksgiving offering. They decorated the front of the temple with golden crowns and small shields. They restored the gates of the chambers for the priests and fitted them with doors. There was great joy among the people, and the disgrace brought by the Gentiles was removed. Then Judas and his brothers and all the assembly of Israel determined that every year, at that season, the days of dedication of the altar should be observed with joy and gladness for 8 days, beginning with the 25th day of the month of Chislev. At that time, they fortified Mount Zion with high walls and strong towers all around to keep the Gentiles from coming and trampling them down as they had done before. Judas stationed a garrison there to guard it. He also fortified Bethzur to guard it, so that all the people might have a stronghold to face Judah. So that is the institution of Hanukkah, which means dedication. And it is when this temple is rededicated. And for 8 days they celebrate it. And Hanukkah is for 8 days. So, it is Kislev. I apologize if I've mispronounced that to other people. It's the month of Kislev, although it's a CH. So it's interesting story there, and you can see how the temple is rededicated and how, again, that's really important to the people of Jesus' day, that what had been so awfully done to them was reversed. They rebuilt it. They even tore down all of the stones of the altar and built a new one in order to cleanse it and make it clean. In some of the texts, which we didn't necessarily get to just for time's sake and we skipped over, there's some interesting bits where they go through and they talk about some different characters of the Bible, and even Maccabees. Let's see if I can even find it. He says, Maccabees, in his sort of dying words, says this: "Remember the deeds of the ancestors," this is in chapter 2, "which they did in their generations, and you will receive great honor and an everlasting name. Was not Abraham found faithful when tested, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness?" Does that sound familiar? Paul uses that same phrase. "Joseph, in the time of his distress, kept the commandment and became Lord of Egypt. Phinehas, our ancestor, because he was deeply zealous, received the covenant of everlasting priesthood." Again, we've mentioned Phinehas already. "Joshua, because he fulfilled the command, became a judge in Israel. Caleb, because he testified in the assembly, received an inheritance in the land. David, because he was merciful, inherited the throne of the kingdom forever. Elijah, because of great zeal for the law, was taken up into heaven. Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael believed and were saved from the flame." From the book of Daniel. "Daniel, because of his innocence, was delivered from the mouth of the lions. And so observe from generation to generation, none of those who put their trust in him will lack strength." So again, and these stories, Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael, along with Daniel, that book, at least parts of it, dates from about the same time as the events of First Maccabees. So interesting to see them there. But that the same, as I mentioned, they see themselves in this line of Jewish history, justifying what they do and seeing their zeal and their fervor for the law as a big part of being in this line of people of Israel, David and Moses and Joshua and Daniel and Elijah. So that takes us all the way up through kind of the early 160s, the rededication of the temple. The rest of the book of First Maccabees is the war continues. It's obviously not over. They fight. Eventually, Antiochus Epiphanes and a few other Greek generals are defeated. First Maccabees chapter 8. the Maccabees and the Jews make a treaty with Rome, which is an emerging nation at the time. They send a letter to the Senate and form a treaty against the Greeks and say, hey, let's be on the same side. Eventually, Judas dies and his sons take over, and the rest of the book is sort of this continuous battle for freedom and autonomy in the land against the sort of Seleucid Greek Empire of the time. And eventually, they do win it, though they are then conquered as Rome grows. Their once ally, Rome becomes so big, and then under Julius Caesar and Caesar Augustus, they sort of conquer all of that area. So that's an interesting bit of history. Next week, we're going to look at a sort of parallel kind of movement of restoration of the law. There's this pattern of what it means to be a faithful Jew and restore the law, be faithful to the covenant. And this was one way that happened in terms of military revolt, that Maccabees and Judas and their family raised swords, raised spears, and fought battles in order to be faithful to the law. And there's different ways that Jews envision that happening and envision that faithfulness to the law and to the covenant playing out. And this is one of those ways. And Judas Maccabeus is not called a Messiah. He's not thought of as the Messiah. But that kind of faithfulness to the law is often what they expected to happen. If Israel was faithless, they began to look at other gods and to not follow the commands of the law. You see that pattern in the Old Testament come up over and over, and it's always then a return to a pretty strict adherence to the law that follows. And so Jesus kind of upsets those expectations in a lot of ways. So thank you for sticking with us, for being part of our second sort of journey looking at the book of Maccabees. First Maccabees. We'll come back next week with a little bit of a different look, but continue kind of looking at the same sort of time period. So thanks for joining us this evening, and have a good week. And say bye. Sleepy Merlin. Bye-bye. Bye, everyone.